You hooked up with Becky last night? Sweet. You got her affirmative consent though, right, bro?
Mackenzie, you got consent forms? Oh yeah, right here, bro. Rise and shine, guys. If you scored last night, I need your consent forms. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Whoa, Barker, did you perform cunnilingus? There's a different release form, bro.
Yeah, sorry, it's right here.
Nice.
Oh, dude. You better turn yourself in. That's sexual assault. By the way, I'm so not a dude, bro. Playing this part's very awkward for me. This is the price I pay for your entertainment, you monsters. Of all the incidents to come to light as a result of the Me Too movement, none have generated more controversy or discussion than the Aziz Ansari case. According to our best reconstruction of the case, Aziz met a woman at a party who shared his interest in photography. They exchanged numbers before the evening was over. They eventually went out on a date that terminated in Aziz's apartment, after which the details become a little hazy. What we do know is first, that Aziz and this woman engaged in sexual activity, and second, that this woman felt that her wishes were not respected throughout. Most of our knowledge of what transpired comes from a website called Babe, in which this woman gives her anonymous account of how things went down. Aziz later confirmed some of the details of this report, though he disputed some other ones. He also indicated that by his lights, everything was, quote, by all indications, completely consensual. The woman, to whom the Babe report refers to under the pseudonym Grace, later told Aziz how she felt via text. Quote, last night might have been fun for you, but it wasn't fun for me. When we got back to your place, you ignored clear, nonverbal cues. You kept going with advances. You had to have noticed I was uncomfortable. This incident has raised all sorts of questions about the nature of consent, as well as the kind of consent that's required for sexual activity to not be sexual assault. Now, what counts as consent, or the right kind of consent, varies by state. And on top of that, college campuses often have their own codes of conduct that differ from the legal standards. Back in my day, the standard was no means no. But this has come under criticism as being too weak of a standard. The thought is that consent shouldn't be the default assumption. Even if you're going along with it, the sexual encounter still might not be consensual, according to critics of the no means no approach. The standard more commonly used these days is called affirmative consent. According to the State University of New York, a member of a growing group of schools that enforces this standard for all sexual encounters between students. Affirmative consent is, quote, a knowing, voluntary, and mutual decision among all participants to engage in sexual activity. Consent can be given by words or actions, an important detail I'll return to in a moment, as long as those words or actions create clear permission regarding willingness to engage in the sexual activity. Silence or lack of resistance, in and of itself, does not demonstrate consent. The affirmative consent policy at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill goes into considerably more detail. Quote, consent requires an outward demonstration, through understandable words or actions, of a clear willingness to engage in sexual contact. The policy goes on to state that, quote, verbal consent is the clearest and safest form of consent. Examples of giving verbal consent include, yes, that sounds great. That feels awesome. Let's do that more. I'd like to. It feels good when you, would you please? I want to keep doing this. I'm enjoying this. That'll set the mood. Regarding nonverbal consent, the policy states, quote, there are ways to express a clear willingness to engage in sexual contact without using words. Examples of giving nonverbal consent may include head nod, thumbs up, nodding yes. Wait, how is this different from the first one? Making direct eye contact, actively touching someone, or initiating sexual activity. Why'd you cut back to me? I'm not doing that on camera. The policy emphasizes the risk of relying on nonverbal communication. Quote, it is important to remember that body language is different for everyone, and relying on it alone can sometimes be problematic. If you're not sure that you're getting a clear, enthusiastic yes from your partner, it is your responsibility to ask. Despite stressing the lack of clarity involved in body language, the policy states that, quote, body language can be used to communicate a lack of consent. Here are some nonverbal signals that you need to stop and check in with your partner. Silent, saying nothing, turning their head or body away from you, pushing you away, lying still, not participating, avoiding touch, not touching you. Moreover, quote, getting consent for one type of sexual contact doesn't mean that you have consent for other kinds. If someone's pulling you closer and they're enthusiastic about making out, it doesn't mean that they've consented to activity beyond making out. Finally, quote, consent can be withdrawn at any time. Once consent's withdrawn, the sexual contact must cease immediately. Confused? Well, UNC's provided this neat little graphic to help you make sure that you're not sexually assaulting your partner. How to ace consent. Consent is affirmative, clear, and enthusiastic. You know, it's just like many other tests. It's just that if you fail this one, you go to jail. Notice the stress on enthusiastic. Some groups insist that consent must be not only affirmative, but also enthusiastic. According to Ebony Tucker, the advocacy director at the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, quote, "Enthusiastic consent is more about paying attention to the person you're having sex with and making sure that they're enjoying what's happening." Tucker said, quote, "If you don't have enthusiastic consent, it could be that you're ignoring what your partner is conveying verbally or non-verbally because you want to engage in the activity. You're not interested in what the person is conveying because you're not interested in having an experience with another person. You're interested in yourself." I'm not going to defend a particular view of consent or the type of consent required for sexual activity to be upright in this video. Instead, I want to focus on the inconsistent way that affirmative consent activists often treat nonverbal implications.
The whole purpose of buying the boat in the first place was to get the ladies nice and tipsy topside so we can take them to a nice, comfortable place below deck and, they can't refuse because of the implication.
That seems really dark.
No, it's not dark. You're misunderstanding me, bro.
I think I am.
Yeah, you are. Because if the girl said no, then the answer obviously is no.
No.
But the thing is she's not gonna say no. She would never say no because of the implication.
First, a few distinctions are in order. Any expression can be verbal or nonverbal, explicit or implicit, and clear or unclear. These distinctions cross-cut each other. An expression is verbal just in case its meaning is conveyed with words. Otherwise, it's nonverbal. An expression is explicit just in case it doesn't require the other party to have a significant amount of background information to understand its meaning. It's implicit just in case it does require the other party to have a significant amount of background information to understand its meaning. And an expression is clear just in case the other party is in a position to easily understand its meaning, either because understanding its meaning requires little background information or because the other party has the relevant background information. Otherwise, it's unclear. Importantly, an expression being nonverbal doesn't prevent it from being clear. A head nod, for instance, is a clear yes or a clear expression of consent, despite being nonverbal. The same with shaking your head. That's a clear expression of no or a lack of consent, despite being nonverbal. I'd also say that both of these expressions are explicit. They require very little background information to understand. Even a child could understand them. More important still, an expression can be nonverbal, implicit, but still clear. Suppose a couple lives in a culture in which inviting someone upstairs is understood to be an invitation to sex. Likewise, the act of going upstairs is considered an expression of consent to this offer.
Would you like to come upstairs for some coffee?
Oh, no, thanks. I can't drink coffee late at night. It keeps me up.
Okay.
Okay.
Good night.
Yeah, take it easy. Take it easy. Take it easy.
Bye.
You're still thinking about this?
She invites me up at 12 o'clock at night for coffee. And I don't go up. No, thank you. I don't want coffee. It keeps me up. Too late for me to drink coffee. I said this to her. People this stupid shouldn't be allowed to live. I can't imagine what she must think of me.
She thinks you're a guy that doesn't like coffee.
She invited me up. Coffee's not coffee. Coffee is sex.
Maybe coffee was coffee.
Coffee's coffee in the morning. It's not coffee at 12 o'clock at night.
Well, some people drink coffee that late.
Yeah, people who work at NORAD or on 24-hour missile watch.
In this case, so long as both parties have the relevant background information, these nonverbal expressions are both implicit and clear. A reasonable, sufficiently informed adult can be expected to understand them. Okay, with those distinctions on the table, let's return to the Aziz case. Recall that Grace accused Aziz of ignoring, quote, clear nonverbal cues, like the fact that she was uncomfortable. Recall, too, that the UNC guidelines indicate that body language and nonverbal signals can communicate a lack of consent. I take it that the signals and cues in question here are supposed to be nonverbal, implicit, but nevertheless clear. They express a refusal of consent without using words. They do so indirectly, but yet they do so clearly. My question is simply this. should nonverbal, implicit, but clear expressions of consent be taken as seriously as nonverbal, implicit, but clear expressions of a lack of consent? It seems to me that consistency requires us to treat these the same. That is, implicit, nonverbal, but clear expressions of consent, and implicit, nonverbal, but clear expressions of a refusal of consent. If that's right, then we have to evaluate all the potential implicit, nonverbal, but clear expressions of consent that Grace likely communicated in the course of her date with Aziz. As I said before, the details of this event are hazy. But let's make a series of safe assumptions. Let's assume that Grace willingly went up to Aziz's apartment. Let's also assume that she willingly took her clothes off, sat on his counter, and let him perform oral sex on her. By my lights, at least, those are some pretty clear, although implicit and nonverbal, expressions of consent. I'm going to assume that Grace is a relatively well-informed adult who is apprised of the relevant social cues. After all, she's not a child. She can therefore be expected to understand the meaning of her actions, and it's on her if she fails to do so. Now, as soon as Grace started communicating signals of discomfort or a lack of consent, it certainly was on Aziz to interpret those correctly and act uprightly in response to them. Presumably, he's also a well-informed adult who's sufficiently apprised of the relevant social cues. It's plausible that he simply ignored some of them. But even here, it's worth asking if the signals and cues in question are expressions of a lack of enthusiasm or expressions of a lack of consent. There's a big difference. There's a big difference between expressing a lack of enthusiasm about a sexual encounter, which could be for a number of reasons on the one hand, and getting up and walking out the door on the other. The former is an expression of a lack of enthusiasm, whereas the latter is very clearly an expression of a lack of consent. So whether Aziz's subsequent actions should be taken to be sexual assault or simply boorish behavior will depend on the kind of consent one requires for sexual activity to be upright and moral. But that's for campus discipline boards to decide. I simply want to make this point. If we're willing to consider expressions of a lack of enthusiasm to be expressions of a lack of consent, then we also have to consider expressions of enthusiasm to be expressions of consent. And that's something proponents of affirmative consent definitely don't want to do. My overall point in this video is that expressions that share the same what could be called conversational profile, that is, they're nonverbal, implicit, and clear, should be treated with the same seriousness, whether it's an expression of consent or a refusal of consent. Well, what do you think? Are these the rantings of a benighted sexist, or do I have a point? Let me know in the comments below. Just be sure to keep it respectful. For more edgy topics and hopefully fair-minded analysis, consider subscribing to my channel, as long as I have your enthusiastic affirmative consent to bring you more content. Until next time, see ya!